Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight for tonight's event with Ben H. Winters and Kira Jane Buxton, here to discuss Ben's new book, The Quiet Boy. We'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website by signing up for our email newsletter, as well as following us on social media at Book Soup. And you can also follow our Crowdcast page right here to get direct notifications. Our next event is this Thursday with Jonathan Parks Ramage and Sam Lansky discussing Jonathan's debut novel, Yes, Daddy. And past events are also available on our YouTube channel. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, and to submit a question, please put a question at the Ask a Question area at the bottom of the screen. It's right to the left of the chat area. And if you see a question on the list you'd like for our speakers to answer, please click the like button if you want to bump it up in the queue, and we will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. And please also feel free to continue engaging in the chat area, because it's always fun, since we're virtual, to know that you are there. Also, please support Book Soup and our authors tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book, which you can do by clicking the green button right below the viewer screen. And that'll redirect you to our website where you can finish the checkout process. And it shouldn't interrupt viewing. It'll open in a new window, so you can do that at any time. And we are selling digital audiobooks and ebooks through Libro FM and Kobo for those interested. We're also open for in-store browsing, so if you're local, you're welcome to come by the store daily from 11 to 5 p.m. with a mask, and we love dogs, so bring your pups if you have them, and shop local. So with that said, I'm going to introduce our guests for this evening, starting with our In Conversation guest, Kira Jane Buxton, whose debut novel, Hollow Kingdom, was a finalist for the Thurber Prize for American Humor, the Audie Awards, and the Washington State Book Awards, and was named a Best Book of 2019 by NPR, Book Riot, and Good Housekeeping. She spends her time with 3 cats, a dog, 2 crows, a charm of hummingbirds, which is amazing, 5 stellar days, 2 dark-eyed juncos, 2 squirrels, and a husband. And my co-host, Millie, tonight is going to introduce our featured author tonight.
Ben H. Winters is a New York Times bestselling author of Underground Airlines, Golden State, and The Last Policeman trilogy. He has been nominated multiple times for the Edgar Award and won it once for The Last Policeman. Other awards include the Philip K. Dick Award, the Sidewise Award for Alternative History. Besides writing books, Ben is a television writer and producer. He lives with his family in Los Angeles, California.
Thank you, sweet.
Perfect. Thank you. That was so beautiful. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera over to Ben and Kira. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam. Oh my goodness, Millie, that was so good. Maybe Millie can come and do my events for me.
I'm sure she'd be delighted, Kira. What do you think?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. She's got a lot of people. They're awesome.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to get to chat with you. This is
Thank you, Kara.
great. As a fan and as somebody who got to read this book, early, I'm so delighted. But I thought I'd start. Probably your fans are dying to know, because it's been a little bit of an unusual year. We could say, when I'm polite about it, I call it a soggy sandwich of a year. How have you been doing?
Thank you. Fine, and it's the sort of thing where it's like, of course it was really hard, and it's really hard. It was really hard for everybody. And like, I find that, like, I'm so lucky, you know what I mean? Like, my family is safe and healthy. And like, Millie is our youngest. We have 3 kids, but they're all she's 9, the other 2 are older. And like, we don't have, they don't have problems. Like, they just did school, and it kind of sucked to be home, but like, they were fine. And like, we were supportive of them, and like, we have a fine internet connection and like enough to eat. And like, so yeah, it sucked. It sucked for the whole world. But like, I feel like we really got off lucky, and I'm very, grateful for it. And I was able to work, I work at home, and like, yeah. It was hard. Yeah, it was kind of hard because everyone was home all the time, but like, okay, I didn't lose my job, and so thank you for asking, but like, totally okay. And like, in a weird way, the pandemic sort of worked its way into this book, because I was sort of in the last lap of writing it when everything started, but like, in a way. So, how are you? How was your experience? Like,
much the same. I have to be I feel just like it's been an opportunity to kind of count my blessings and be grateful. My family's very far away. We were just chatting about that. My family's in Italy and I've got family in Canada. And, I wrote a book about how terrible technology is for all of us. And then here it is, rescuing me every day. I get to see, my family, and I get to, do this and chat with you. So whoops.
I know. All these things we complain about, like my kids have had so much screen time over a lot. Like we spend so much time carefully parceling out their screen time. And all of a sudden I was like, go, all day, whatever you have to do, like at bedtime, which
totally.
Is crazy, but
Totally. Well, good. That's so good to hear. And I, if you allow me to gush about your marvelous book for a little minute. In the pandemic, I did feel like one of the things that happened to me is my attention span. I had the attention span of a goldfish, and like maybe a juvenile goldfish. Like I just couldn't focus, and I had trouble reading. And I don't know if anybody else who's listening had this. I really did struggle a bit to read, and I went back to some like childhood favorites and was trying to. And then I got this beauty, and I was thrilled because it's such an interesting amalgamation of things. It's such an interesting blend that you put together. It's not only this kind of riveting mystery, of two investigations, and it covers one of my favorite themes in life and in literature, which is interconnectedness. And, what we inherit from each other, and when an event happens, how that kind of reverberates, through families and through the people we know. So, I was like reading it like this, like compulsively flipping pages, but also I felt like it was a very reassuring and a very soothing novel to read, because there's a real current of tenderness. And maybe that has to do with, where you were, as you said. I'm fascinated for you to talk about, the pandemic influence on this. But to stop gushing and to get to a question,
you just gush the whole time.
I could. How did The Quiet Boy, how did this lovely, lovely book come into existence?
Well, this book had a long gestational period, which is actually, I started this book in late 2015 or early 2016, actually. After Underground Airlines, I made a deal with my next sort of, book deal was with Little Brown, with Mulholland, which is my publisher, to do 2 books. It was a 2-book deal. And I started this book, what would become this book, which was that time called The Prisoner. And I was like getting into it. And then, I don't know if you remember, there was a rather surprising presidential election in the fall of 2016. And it was like bananas and it was crazy. And all of a sudden I felt very disconnected from this. And I felt like I really wanted to do something political. Like I think a lot of people, I was feeling kind of worked up about our place in the world, and particularly about the nature of politics and lying and everything. So anyway, we went to the publisher and we were like, how I have a 2-book deal? Well, can I do the other book first and then come back to this book? And my editor at Mulholland, who's this amazing guy named Josh Kendall, who's both an amazing editor and just a dear friend and a smart guy, was like, sure. Basically, sure. And so anyway, I wrote that book, which is called Golden State, and that came out, and it was really fun and interesting and very political. And then I came back to this and came back to it, I think, in a better place to deal with it. Because as you say, it's a big book. It has a lot of pieces to it. And it's, of everything I've ever written, it is in a way the most reflective of me as a person. Because like I've always been the kind of writer where I'm like, I'm not autobiographical. I don't really plumb my own experience. I have I was very blessed with a very stable home life, and I don't have a sort of a tumultuous, I was always just like, I just come up with crazy ideas as opposed to drawing from some well. But this book turned out to be the one. It's about being a dad. It's about being a Jew. It's about being a bass player. Like all this stuff that like was from in a husband and I don't know, just like what it means to be a person, I guess. So it's a long way around, but like, I guess it's all of a sudden it was like all this stuff was boiling up. And then, what was the question? Yeah. So then the book that I had started writing that I put aside would not have been as good as this book ended up being from the fact that I took that year or whatever it was off and wrote the other book. Like, I think that the book that ultimately emerged is a stronger and weirdly more personal thing.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
I guess so. It was always going to be braided timelines. And we should set it up, I guess. Like the book is about,
yes, of course.
It takes place in the present and in the past. Although I'll talk about that in a second too, because I had to change the present because of the pandemic. But basically it takes place in 2019 and in 2008, essentially. In 2008, this lawyer is helping this family sue a hospital after their son inexplicably is fucked up by this surgery. And then in 2019, it's the same family, the same lawyer, but now the dad from that family is on trial for murder. And it emerges that it's the expert witness from the original trial that he is supposedly, allegedly killed. And so these two trials, these two cases interweave. And at the center of it is this kid, the kid who fell down and who was inexplicably stricken. And so at the very beginning of the book, of the writing of the book, Kira, it was about, and I can't remember what it's called right now, but I had read about this syndrome that some people have where they don't recognize people that they've known a long time. So you would see your husband or your mom or something, and you would think that person's an imposter. And I thought it was the most fascinating thing. And I sort of imagined that this had happened to this kid and he didn't recognize his parents. And it was about what it would feel like as a parent to experience that. That was the very germ of the book.
Okay.
So it's always been about parents and parenting and like the relationship between parents and children, but then it grew and grew and grew into this crazy thing, whatever it is now.
Yeah. But so it's such a, well, I mean, comparatively to some of, for example, the last Policeman trilogy, Underground Airlines, certainly Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters are so firmly rooted in speculative fiction, so, toward that genre that it's, when you had that initial idea, did you, because there is a little bit of a supernatural, a little bit of a speculative element that is a beautiful part of the mystery. So I will say nothing about it. But was that, had you planned that when you started the draft in 2016 or 2015?
I guess so. I always knew there was going to be something speculative about it or something science fiction-y, if only as a market demand, because I think it would be hard for me as a writer at this point to get away with a book that's just like, social realism or just like, even just a straight murder mystery. At this point, I guess I'm lucky that I have somewhat of a career that is built around this kind of blending or overlay of some significant weirdness onto what would otherwise be a traditional, genre thing, right? So I think going into pitching the book, I was like, well, what is going on here? And so I think that's how I got to that kind of interdimensional element that you're noting. But it is, aside from that, is definitely the most, I guess, grounded for all of its weirdnesses and like complications of the plot. It's the most just like, it takes place in a reality that is most recognizable. Of all my books, it's the one where it's like, oh, this is just LA. This is just regular life. And then this crazy thing happens, as opposed to it being like in the Policeman novels and Underground Airlines, certainly in Golden State, those books are set in alternate realities, in worlds that are, funhouse mirror versions of our reality. Takes place here and now. And the crazy shit that happens, the characters react to it in the way that we would react to it if it happens. Like, what is going on? Which was a new challenge for me too. And I think took a little bit of me stepping outside what had become my comfort zone, because although the characters are a little heightened and a little bit like intense in their ways, they're just people. And having to write people who are just people without that kind of falling back on, well, yeah, but they're in this alternate universe, so that the ways they act might not be totally realistic, but that's not my jam. It's like, no, I had to get away. Like, okay, how would real people, like, what are real emotions? How do you write real conversations? Like, that's hard.
That is fascinating to me. I totally relate to that. I just dabbled with a little bit of fantasy, and I had that same thought, like, no one can tell me what a centaur would do or feel.
Kira's book, you guys totally read also, Hollow Kingdom, the main character is a crow. And it's like, he has a personality, and he's a comic protagonist, but he's a crow. So Kira gets to decide what his point of view is. And then your job is, what your job is, but to and you do it, but to make sure that once that crow character is established, that he remains tonally the same and has a growth arc and is, we root for him, but he's in the same way, it's like in Underground Airlines, it's like, well, that protagonist is existing in a world that is not our world. So you can kind of get away with that a little.
Exactly. And I feel like, you get to a point where you rely on that, that becomes sort of who you are as a writer, that you take those risks. And then, as you say, to take on, a more sort of grounded relationship, or it becomes a little.
And I love it. I mean, I'm, and it's one of the reasons that I am really proud of this novel, but I'm also anxious. I mean, you're always anxious when a book comes out, but it's like, I don't know exactly what people are going to make of this. And I guess once again, you never do, right? But it's like the heroes of this book essentially are a father and a son, and they're just guys. I mean, they're just people. And like, Jay is a lawyer and Ruben he works at a casual salad restaurant. And it's like people, it's regular people. And like, I've never really done that before.
Yes, but you've done it so well. And I don't think you should worry, because that felt to me, because as enticing as the supernatural element is, the thing that had me, really hooked was these characters and their interconnectedness, this concatenation of characters. And I felt like, can we talk about, because I know, the exciting thing is that, some people won't have read this that are listening, and I want them to pay attention to these characters, because I felt so deep. I felt very strongly about them. I felt so my favorite character is Jay Shenk, who you mentioned, the lawyer. And you have rendered him so spectacularly, because in himself, he's this, it's easy to judge him quickly. He is a little bit of a sleazy guy. He's got the ponytail and the silver suit and the tan shoes, and he's an ambulance chaser, sort of unabashedly, right? He's got this guy, Malloy the boy, right, who's like lurking around hospitals, sniffing.
Malloy is a nurse who basically runs the network of nurses who feed Shank potential lawsuits. So Malloy will call him and be like, listen, I heard about this slip and fall up in Riverside. You should go after this. And then he'll bring Malloy out, $500 or whatever it is. He'll give him a cut. So yeah, he's a scumbag. Jay is
Jay is, but he's also one of the most endearing characters because of this relationship with his son Ruben. I just adored the guy. I felt like he needs his own series, I think. I love him. I want to see him on the screen. I love it. But he also kind of, for me, distilled this idea in the novel that as I was going on, I found a lot of it is about, how we judge things. And as a reader, you read this novel and you're sort of trying to figure out the mystery, but you're also reading the characters, who's, what's going on, who's this. And I felt like Jay beautifully exemplifies that there's such a complexity to his humanity. So tell me about how he came along. And
I love that. Thank you so much. Like for Jay, I can boil it down to character. It's like the word both, right? I use this word both with Jay a lot. I use the word both a lot. Everybody does. It's a very common English word. But like for Jay, there's a scene with Beth, who's the mom in the family. And he's basically, I can try to find it. Sorry. There's a scene early on where he's pitching himself to her. He finds his way into the hospital. He figures out who this kid is, and he finds the mom, and he sidles up to her outside the hospital. And he doesn't say he's a lawyer yet. He makes friends with her. He lights her cigarette. He's empathetic, and it's a seduction scene. He doesn't want to, go out with her, but he wants this job, and he works his way toward it. We're watching him work his way toward it. And basically, I'm asking the reader, it's like, well, is he just trying to make a buck here? But at the same time, Jay believes in his heart, in his soul, that if they hire him, he's going to fight and win and get them a lot of money. And it's not going to make their kid better, but it's going to make the situation better. And he sees himself that way. So it's both. Yeah, he wants the case, but he also wants to help these people. He loves them. And like, it's that bothness that I found really rich. And also like, I appreciate you said before that there's a tenderness to it. And to me, that's the tenderness. It's like all of these characters are in their way kind of assholes and kind of like, I think definitely is the worst, but like people have flaws. Everybody does. And people like are selfish, and we kind of stumble through life trying to do the best by other people, but sometimes it's hard. And like, there's a sense, I hope, of like we're rooting for them anyway. and the doubleness of the timeline, it allows us to meet Shenk when he's, a younger man, and he's like, oh, this got vim, and he can't wait to get these cases, and he's like, raring to go. And then in the present day timeline, he's kind of a wreck. He's a shell. And like, we're waiting to see what happened, but also to see if by the end of it, he can get some of that old Shenk back, and so that's playing with the mystery of time was part of what and it's a Jennifer Egan, the book. Have you read Visit from the Squad? The book is it's like such a beautiful, amazing book. But like she says in there, she's like, time is a goon. And like, so time is a character in the book, like what it does to people is really something. So anyway, that's
yeah. That and that comes across so much with the characters, because there is this extraordinary, time jumping that, if not done well, that can be so disorienting. And so I have not done this yet as a writer. So trust me, I'm taking a lot of notes.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I really there are a few books that do it extremely well. One of them is, which I read because I love Scott Turow, and he writes these legal thrillers, and I think Scott Turow gets written off a little bit, not by smart people, but by people who are just sort of from a distance, like, well, he's just writing these beach books, they're legal thrillers. But Turow is like, he's a master craftsman. And there's a book called Laws of Our Fathers, I think it's called, or I may be slightly mistitling it, Laws of Our Fathers. But like, that is a double timeline book. And just like, I charted out I ended up using a slightly different, but I was noting when he pivots back and forth and the way he does it. Because it's also like this book, it's multiple protagonists, which that's another thing I did in this book I've never done before, is using multiple points of view. Because like, I was always been scared basically. And I kept going back to like Last Policeman. It really worked for me that book was first person, present tense. And it was like, everything that happens, we see through Hank's eyes. And like, I don't have to worry about, cut away to the villain and like, what's he doing? Nope. It's all just Palace. And yeah, it's like, nope, don't have to do that. And actually that book, the little girl who introduced me, who is going to be 10 this year, I have vivid memories of finishing The Last Policeman with her. She was on my lap, like 2 and 3 months old, because I had written the most of that book in the third person. And I realized to my horror that was wrong. It was due relatively soon, that it really had to be in first person. And so I went back and read through the whole thing. And it was right after she was born. I have these very strong memories of it. Because crazy. Anyway.
Wow. Gosh. I can't imagine doing that. Oh God, that's a lot of work.
You would if you had to. That's the thing about writing. Once you realize that something is wrong, you can't let yourself just let it live. You're like, oh no, fuck, shit, I got to start over, or whatever it is. It sucks.
I've doomed myself.
Exactly.
Also, about the research for the book, because I think this will appeal to people who love legal thrillers. I think there's some fascinating medical shenanigans, shall we say, and then also this crazy litigious journey, 2 separate investigations, absolutely phenomenal. So I know a tremendous amount of research that makes me nervous thinking about it. What did you do?
I did a lot of research. I love research. It's my favorite part of writing, because I get to say I'm writing, but you don't actually have to be writing. So like, I'm a big fan of reading books and sort of processing what they have to say. So, and then also interviewing people. I think it's like the great secret of writing books, that like, you find an expert in some subject matter and you reach out to that person and you're like, hey, I'm writing a novel. I need to know everything you can tell me about whatever it is. And most people are like, great. You know what I mean? Like, people love, if you've spent your life learning some trade or knowledge base, if someone shows up and is like, please tell me everything, like, it's a great opportunity for someone to just like sing their song. And like, and then you find out things, you might go in with 2 questions. And then as they're talking, you realize there's so much you didn't even know that you didn't know. So I did that a lot way back writing the policeman novels. I was reaching out to, there's astrophysicists and like tax adjusters, like, there's all this, granular stuff. And I realized that was going to be a part of my craft and my process. And so with this one, definitely a lot of lawyers. There's actually sad. There's a man here in LA who, he works at a big firm, a really famous, personal injury firm, because it was the firm that Aaron Brockovich was at. the real life firm. And so I reached out to him, and we had like a wonderful long meeting, and he told me so much about this particular kind of case, medical malpractice cases in California. Because there's these very specific things I had no idea about, like how much you can sue for, how it works, the timetable. And then I called him back, right, when I was rewriting in the edit process, and he had passed away. And I wrote about it in the acknowledgments. It was just really sad because he was in his 50s, a young guy. Anyway, but so that that's all in here. My brother, my dog woke up.
It's part of the deal, I mean, they.
I know you're an expert too.
He has something to say about lawyers, I guess.
He does. He loves lawyers. It's okay. I think he's all right. My brother is a lawyer. My brother in Concord,
okay.
And he does lots of different things. But I called him, and he helped me out with a couple specific things that were really useful. So a lot of law, and then I actually have a cousin, a first cousin who does brain science.
Neuroscience.
Yeah, he does neuroscience at Ball State. Her name is Stephanie Simon Dack, and she is a professor of brain science. She's amazing. And she was so generous with her time. And we talked several times, and she sent me all this wonderful. So all that stuff, it goes into the funnel. You know what I mean? And you don't know what you're going to do with it, but then at those key moments, it's oh yeah, totally. I remember that. And the caveat is always I hope I didn't screw stuff up. And if I screwed stuff up, it's not their fault. It's my fault. You know what I mean? But,
it makes me laugh because they're, yes, it's scary to then, layer that into your work. I
know. Go ahead.
No, I was going to reference a very stupid thing I wrote I wrote a humor piece for the New Yorker, which was basically excerpts from books that I wrote that I did zero research for. And it's just this idea of someone writing a book that didn't do the research just tickles me, because that would be me if I wasn't.
Was that a Shouts and Murmurs column?
It was, yeah.
Oh my God, I'm looking up. Good for you. That's amazing.
Very silly thing, but I think of it every time I've written your book, I've thought of it as I was reading how excellent the research was. And it's set mostly in LA.
It is.
And
not only that, it's mostly in my neighborhood. Most of this book is set within a 2 mile radius of where I'm sitting right now. Because that's just, I love street names. You know what I mean? I love, I feel like that, even if you've never been to a place, when you read a book and you get a sense of that it is specific to this universe, you can feel it. I think it adds to the richness of the book. But it's my LA book.
Is it reverence? So what? Sorry, no. It feels like it comes from a place of reverence, that you love LA and this.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. I've been here. My family and I moved here about 5 years ago, and I love it so much. And I know there's a lot to knock about LA, and all those things are probably true, but I find it to be fascinating. I think it's culturally really interesting. I think the history of LA is really interesting. And the diversity of the people is really interesting. And also just the fact that the whole town is built on entertainment. I mean, there's lots of different, but LA was literally the reason it became a big town is because of the film business. And you read these stories about the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and you would be on the crosstown bus with someone dressed as Julius Caesar and someone is dressed as a nun. And you know what I mean? It's this weird, so illusion and stagecraft and artifice is just sort of woven into the universe of it. And actually there's a scene I set in this book that's set at a film studio, and they're making a movie. And because Ruben, who's the young hero, he's Shenk's son, and he basically gets bullied into being a private investigator by his dad. And so he is whatever. And so he goes to interview this guy who is working security who was involved, whatever. He's working security on this. And I set the scene in this stage set because I find movie sets so fascinating. Just the fact that people are deep into this other world, this alternate universe. And then a bell rings, and a buzzer goes, and then there's they just go over to get a sandwich. It's just this crazy permeability between imagined realities. And by the way, careful readers who know my work will recognize that the movie they're making, or the TV show, it's a TV show that they're shooting a pilot in The Quiet Boy when he goes there. And it's a pilot of my previous book, Golden State. It's a scene from Golden State that I've now made into just for my own amusement.
An excellent Easter egg. Yeah,
exactly.
I love that. I love that crossover. Yeah, I could tell. I felt I don't have such a good relationship with LA. I think because of when I was there, but it made me nostalgic for it, and it made me want to repair the relationship a bit. And there's a
You should come down.
I should, and I was supposed to this year actually, but I wanted to ask about there's a restaurant. I think it's Tommaso's or something. Call it. Is that real?
It's not real. It's based on a real place. There is a real
station.
There is a real restaurant. No, it's not. It's called the real place is called Grill on the Alley, I think. It's in Beverly Hills, and you go down a little alley, and it's very fancy in there. It's I've only eaten there once. I can't remember who I ate there with, but it was not on me. It was on the other person. I remember that. I didn't pay. And it's the sort of thing where like the waiters are very brusque and businesslike and very good at what they do, but they're just like, here's your breadsticks. And like, there's definitely people there, as there are in the scene in the book. I think the scene where Shenk is negotiating a settle. He's trying to get the other lawyer to settle. So it's
a marvelous scene. It's so perfect. And that it's set in this very high-end Beverly Hills restaurant, and the other lawyer is eating a fish with way too many bones in it. And that's
it was really fun, right? And Shenk being like, oh, look, there's JC. Oh, no, that's not JC. And the other lawyer doesn't care at all. He's not interested. Yeah. So stuff like that. There's just a little bit of, I don't know if you would call it social satire or like, but it's funny because LA satirizes itself. You don't even have to, that scene isn't really heightened. It's just like they're just eating at this restaurant and it's slightly ridiculous. And it's like, that's what it is. There really is this place in Beverly Hills that doesn't have its name on the door. You have to go down this weird alley. And then it's like, they change the menu every day for the seasonal vegetables. And like, but there's also in the book, Shenk's law firm is upstairs. It's at a strip mall, and it's upstairs from a donut place and a nail salon. And there's a yoga place. And it's just like, I love those places. Like one of the things I love the most about LA is like, it is full of these strip malls, and every strip mall has its own little character to it and feel to it. And some of them have like incredible restaurants, and you have to just know like, oh, there's this Indian place that like, it's in this random spot in Culver City, or like if you drive such and such off the 101 and take a right, there's like the best Japanese food outside of Japan. It's like, what? Like, I think it's amazing.
Yeah,
so,
that's how I know you're fully integrated into LA. Is that even in the novel? I think it's Ruben. Somebody gives directions and says that you have to take the 405 to the 101, and I'm like, okay, this is what 100% Angelina.
That's a cool vibe of the one. That's one part of the last year that I have not missed. Is all like right now all the driving is starting to come back because everyone's like, oh, we should meet in person. I'm like, oh, do we have to meet in person? All right, you have to leave an hour early, because you never know what's going to happen on the 405.
Oh, it's true. It's true. So yes, as we said, there's like many different characters, different viewpoints. Who was your favorite to write, and who was a little harder to write?
Well, I mean, Shenk is probably my favorite to write just because I feel like I know him really well. And I feel like he has a very specific attitude. I always know what he's trying to get in whatever scene he's in. It's like he acts very quickly and his motivations are always very clear. And like, he's a hustler. He's always hustling, whether he's trying to get a job or he's trying to get Ruben to do something, or he's trying to get, oh God, so one of my favorite scenes is a little later in the book where it's him and the expert witness, and she is very buttoned up and very dry and very serious. And he knows he's got to put her on the stand, and he knows he's got to get the jury to respond to her, to like her, because he says to her, like, he's like, if I just wanted the information, I could put it on a piece of paper. Like, I need you to engage. And he's trying to get her to engage. So like, he always has a mission. So I could write him forever. For me, I mean, honestly, like the harder characters are Beth, who's the mom from the family.
The mother who's sort of going through this really difficult experience, her son having this very mysterious medical ailment. Yeah.
And I hope she comes across, but she was hard for me to write, both because her experience is so heightened and catastrophic. Like she has, in a way, she's lost her son, but which is so painful and complicated emotionally to show, but also because of the supernatural element to it. Like, she doesn't know exactly what the hell happened to him. And she can't abandon the hope or the feeling that if she just figures this out, she can drag him back to life. And like, so that's tricky. And also, honestly, it's harder to write women. I haven't written women protagonists. And like, I don't think there's any essential difference between men and women that make it impossible or like extra challenging, but just for me, I didn't have the comfort level. So it took me a few tries to figure out who exactly she was and what her voice was. I think she might be the furthest afield from my experience. But I hope that she comes through. And I think like it took me, like I said, a couple tries at her. And then I think I found what feels like her voice. And I love that character, and she gets the last, well, I don't want to, she gets to round out the book, and I think that her journey is the trickiest one. And I hope that I sort of, what do they say? I hope I stuck the landing on it,
Oh, yes, I would say so. Yeah, that's something, as I was reading, I feel like you really are participating in the mystery. You're trying to, figure out, and you're following the lawsuits, and you're wondering this whole time about, what happened to this boy. But the ending, and we won't talk about the ending, obviously, for obvious reasons, but I do want to say that it was incredibly satisfying.
Oh, good.
And I think it was an ending that I did not see coming, and that I was nervous about the ending, which is well, that's what I was going to ask. When you were plotting it, did you know where you were going? That I should say that in a much more eloquent way.
No. It's funny, and we were talking about process a little before we got on the call. Like I knew where I was going more or less, and I have found that in my experience, it's always good to have some idea of where you're headed. So even if it's like you have to fool yourself, because you're not ultimately going to end up writing that. It's going to be at least a little different, and yet you have to give yourself that roadmap. You have to pretend that you know what you're doing. You have to pretend you know what you're doing long enough to figure out what you're really doing. Yeah. There, that'll be I'll stitch that on a pillow. You have to pretend you know what you're doing long enough to figure out what you're actually going to do. So I think I had a pretty good idea all along. I don't think this is a spoiler. Like all along, I knew what happened at the motel that night. Like, because we're trying to solve this, trying to figure out what the defense is going to be for this, for the man who's accused of murder. I think I knew all along what happened, and I think I had the other stuff is the crazy stuff. It took me a while to figure out the kind of supernaturally stuff. It took me a little while to figure out how to pay that off, and I tried a few different things. But what's funny about the supernatural stuff is that with that, you can't fall back on the research. There's no once you introduce an element of like people, a cult claiming that they have, access to another world that's going to heal all of us and elevate us to a higher plane of existence. It's like, there's no fact checking that. Like, I just got to figure out where to take it and how to land it. As opposed to the neuroscience, which you can suggest what is really going on, as opposed to the forensic stuff, which like, well, there are certain steps that the cops will take and all that. It's like, this is just, we'll see if they buy it or not,
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I'm excited for everybody to read it. That's the difficulty of now is wanting to talk about how good the ending is.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask, so the cover is absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah. Isn't it fantastic?
It really is. It's so striking and it's so beautiful. Who did your cover and what was the process like? Because I know every single book, the planning for the cover is a very different story.
Yep. I'm looking it up because I'm embarrassed to say I forgot the guy's name. Greg Kulik. Jack by Greg Kulik. And honestly, this was I gave barely any notes. They basically sent me a rough version of this pretty early on. I was like, I love it. And I think that the colors are amazing. I think they're like the sort of pink and black is a little unexpected. I think there's an unquestionable kind of Hitchcock quality to it. I think it's killer. Yeah, I really do. Thank you.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. I also haven't, I got so excited to jump into questions, I didn't give you an opportunity to read. Do you want to
That's
read
okay. I mean, I'll read a paragraph or two just because it's fun. Here, so this is just one of the paragraphs that introduces Jay Shenk. And basically, so he's heard about this kid. He doesn't know anything about it, but he's going to go to the hospital to try to figure it out. Shenk in a hospital lobby was Shenk in full, chin angled up, chest thrust forward, ponytail dancing at his nape, marching forward like a man at the head of a parade. Shenk was an aficionado of hospital lobbies, of their informational kiosks and layered odors and vast soaring atriums. How many times had he passed through the whoosh of automatic doors, strode along the speckled linoleum tiles and down the beige hallways, past the seascapes and the still lifes and the soft light portraits of elderly philanthropists. I'm going to skip down just a little bit. And whom did Shenk love the most? Most of all, Shenk loved the clientele, the consumers, the customers, the sick and the families of the sick, murmuring and muttering, worried and weary, leaning on the walls or wandering confused in search of a vending machine or a bathroom, or just slumped in those lumpy, overstuffed lobby sofas under the too bright lights, hungry but unable to eat, weepy but unable to cry. They were alone or stood in groups of 2 and 3, clutching at scraps of tissue and sipping lukewarm coffee and staring wanly out the tinted glass in baffled contemplation of a loved one's mortality and, inevitably, their own. They sat grimly, waiting for news. They made exhausted phone calls, keeping someone out there in the loop, or keeping themselves tethered to the rush of life that continued while they were in here, in the tedious no time of hospital waiting. As he made his way to the massive, semicircular volunteer desk, Shenk's spirit flew out to all of them, all the hospital people gathered in the purgatorial half-light of the lobby. His own heart a corona of empathy, expanding outward through the damaged world.
It's so good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh,
First time I read
it's so good.
I really like it. Thank you very much. I'm proud of those. I'm proud of those paragraphs because you know this too, I'm sure. Like there are some parts that just come out really easily, and there's some parts where you know what you want it to be, but it takes a lot of drafts to get it there. And definitely the hospital portions, I was like, I really, really want this to feel right. Like I really want to feel like I'm bursting into a hospital, and I love hospitals. And like they're not necessarily the most lovable places, but like, what is somebody who loves hospitals? How does I used to teach briefly? I had a gig teaching 5th and 6th graders creative writing, and I remember specifically the thing of like, so you want to describe a barn, but like your character's in a good mood. How do they describe the barn? Your character's in a shitty mood. I didn't say shitty probably, but your character's in a sad mood. How do they describe the barn? And that little thing of just like seeing the world, not just how it is, but through a certain person's perspective is like so key. And I feel like it's like the heart of all good writing is like not just seeing, but seeing specifically as one person or animal or whatever sees. Like, so anyway, that's how Jay sees the lobby.
Yes, perception is everything. And yeah, I think that's what makes him such a, I mean, not to harp on about Shenk all the time, but he's, you know, that's what it's so he's so beautifully dichotomous, you know, that he's those really disparate things that you wouldn't put together, you know, the ambulance chaser and then the deep lover of all the hospital
He loves people. He loves people. He loves hospitals. He loves his son. And like his poor son is always like, I don't want to, I mean, that's the relationship that's at the heart of the book is between Ruben and his boy. And Ruben is always like, he didn't articulate this because he's a little bit, but he's always like, Dad, I want you to love me specifically for a second. You know what I mean? Like his dad is always just like rhapsodizing and monologuizing and like loving everything. And like, oh, work was so exciting. But like, he sort of like blows past Ruben a little bit. It's just like, how are you? Great. And like, Ruben just wants so much for him to just focus on him that I think that is this sadness that, I don't know. That's this kind of relationship at the heart of it.
Yeah.
Question, Kira.
I have a question. I'm not far enough into the book to have a grasp of any speculative elements. Ooh, but what you briefly described sounded sort of Lovecraftian. Was he an influence? And if not, who or what was? Awesome question by Susan Tunis, who is one of the greatest people ever.
Oh my God. Yeah, well, great. That's a good question. All I know about Susan
is a bookseller. She's a marvelous bookseller, and she's one of the most well-read people that I know. She's marvelous. Hi, Sue, too. That's a great question.
I wish I had a great answer. I am not the hugest Lovecraft guy. I've read some Lovecraft, but not recently, and definitely not enough to be super influenced by him, I don't think. I mean, I think the idea at the center of it, of the what drives the supernatural plotting is that there is this cult. They're kind of a cult that sort of thinks that there's this, that the boy who is frozen in time has essentially become almost a portal to another world. And so what I suspect is that my influences on that idea, who are going to be people like Stephen King or even just like Twilight Zone stuff, that my influences were in turn influenced by Lovecraft, who I know laid the foundation for those, or one of the foundations of that kind of storytelling. So let's say that I was influenced by Lovecraft intergenerationally. And it's funny because I'm pretty well read in crime and mystery fiction, but although my work has become quite sci-fi and speculative, I'm less well read in that genre. Although I do love sci-fi and speculative, and like more and more so. The main sci-fi author who's like always been a mainstay for me would be Philip K. Dick, but also like Asimov. So some of the bigger, more recent, or like I guess the 60s, 70s stuff. But anyway, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. I love hearing about, how fiction changes the brain and that we influence each other in this way through the magic of books. It's wondrous. Wondrous. Another question here from Maddie is, can you comment on how you get yourself into the right mindset to write characters of a different gender or race?
Oh boy. Great question. And it's an important question.
This is right from the perspective of crows.
Yeah, right. I've had a lot of, I have a complicated relationship with this question just because 2 books ago, I wrote this book, Underground Airlines, which was not only from the perspective and from the narrative voice of an African-American man, but also the book deals with slavery and the legacy of slavery and systemic racism in America, and sort of plunged me into that question of like, well, first of all, to what degree is it appropriate and okay for me to write that book? And also, how do I do it? And like, I think the answer always has to be, instead of going, okay, well, how do Black people talk? Or, okay, I'm a dude, how do women talk? I don't know. Like, you have to think about the specific character, right? The specific individual human, and what are the things that have influenced them? What challenges, what background, what is their relationship to the world? What are their cultural influences? All the things that shape a person. And so what makes their voice? Because I think it's just as dangerous to say, well, there's certainly pitfalls to it. It can feel somehow risky or dangerous to do it. But at the same time, as authors, like, you got to do it. Like, I don't want to just write books from the point of view of a middle-aged Jewish man. Like, I'm nothing against it. There have been many great ones, like all of Philip Roth's books, but like, that's not my jam, And I feel like authors, it's 2 things. You have a responsibility to do it, or at least, you have a right to think outside your own perspective, but at the same time, you have a responsibility to not be an asshole about it. So to think carefully about that individual person's experience, what would their voice sound like? And what I discovered with airlines is that at a certain point, I had to, once I had written enough of Victor, I had to let go of worrying about, am I kind of getting this right? Does this sound like a real person, a real Black person? And be like, well, no, it's him. It's this man. And he is the product of his experience. So when I came to this book, the long answer, like, the female characters, similarly, I had to think about Beth and about Teresa from not just some generic, well, they're girls or they're women, so what do they think like? But like, how were they individually shaped? And then the young hero, we haven't mentioned this yet, Reuben, is adopted. And so he's a Jew, like Shenk is a Jew, but ethnically, he's Asian. He's from Vietnam. And like, but that is a fact of his character that is very determinative of the way he exists in the world. The fact that he looks at himself in the mirror and sees a person who does not look like he feels inside, or like the background that Shenk has given to him, the cultural impressions, like, that's part of who he is. It's an important part of who he is. So like, I'm not trying to write some generic person who's Asian. I'm writing Reuben Shenk. Like, there's no one like Reuben Shenk. And so like, that's the place you have to try to get to, I guess. I love that question. I could talk about that forever. Like, it's
really, and deep empathy, deep research, I think is really key. I think, making sure that you really follow through with the characters, as you say, and it's not, you're not a cardboard cutout of a certain person or whoever they are. And that goes for any character, doesn't it? It
totally does. It's just that like, we have a responsibility. I say we, but like as white people, I guess, or as like, because of the social structures in this country, because of the social structures in publishing, because of like the history of the way that minorities, especially African Americans, have been portrayed in books by white people. It's like, you can't just be like, I can write whatever I want, and I don't care what anybody says. I think we have a responsibility to actually engage with it, to think about it. I would recommend to you, there's a woman named Nisi Shaw who writes brilliantly on this subject about like the history of it, writing the other, how to go about doing it intelligently and articulately. Anyway, I love that question. Thank you for asking, Maddie.
Great question. I've got another one. If anybody's welcome to chime in with questions. I want to ask a little bit about Evie, because she's a character, Evelyn.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, we even talked about her. She's the older sister of Wesley, the boy who has this mysterious situation going on, this medical crisis. But she's a sort of up and coming rock star, right? Yeah. She's like this indie darling.
Indie darling. I think I described specifically. What? Was
it to write a rock star? I mean, that was
awesome. So fun. I think specifically I think I describe her as an indie darling. I say something like she's not a rock star. At some point I wrote a draft and Josh, my editor, was like, oh, she's like Billie Eilish. I was like, no, she's not as famous as Billie Eilish yet. She's like up and comer. So she's playing clubs. I think she has one album out and she's recording her second album. People on Instagram know her. She's super cool. And again, it's like her voice. I played music a lot when I was a kid. I played bass in a band, and it was a big part of my life for a long time. And like, so accessing her world was a little bit like I knew a little bit how to write about music, just the way songs are structured and stuff. There's this song that she plays that I spent like a page describing her in concert. It's like, again, it's one that I labored over it because I wanted to be perfect. But like, her voice in terms of like, well, she's a young woman, right? She's like a 22-year-old woman. And like, I'm much older than her and I'm not a woman. And yet I know a little bit what it feels like to create, because I mean, I'm a novelist. It's a different kind of artist, but like I'm writing and I know what it feels like to present yourself to the public and sort of expose this thing that you've created to other people. And I know how to write and I know how to play chords. Like I know all of that. And at the same time though, like Reuben was shaped by his experience of being brought up by Shenk, like she was shaped by the fact that her brother, since she was a kid, her brothers had this terrible situation going on and her family is like consumed by it and her whole life circles around it. And like, what does that do to a person? And like, how did she have to sort of escape from that orbit? And what she escaped into was music. And like, so that becomes the voice of her. As opposed to just like, okay, what does a 22-year-old girl sound like? She probably says like a lot. Like, no. Like, you got to come to it from like, what is her story? And like, she talks a little bit poetically and a little bit elusively. And I think it's a little bit like, well, she's a rock star and she's cultivating a persona, but also she's hiding because the world has been really tough and like, it's easier to hide. So like, that's where she comes from.
Yeah, and such a great example of what the question that Maddie asked that you put into practice there. I thought you really captured Evie so beautifully. Yeah. She was giving me kind of very early Gaga vibes, like very early when she was playing clubs, or maybe like Shirley Manson.
Totally, totally, because she's a rock star, but she's not like a pop star where it's like it's all about like, oh, she's hot and she's wearing skimpy outfits and like she's smart. You know what I mean? She's really smart. She's a great songwriter. Like, I think of her a little bit like Phoebe Bridgers, although at this point Phoebe Bridgers is like has jumped up. But like when I was writing this, Phoebe Bridgers was like right in there. It was like, oh, she's going to be huge. You know what I mean? So she has this song that she's playing that she took the first line of the Dylan song, Just Like a Woman, where Dylan sings "Nobody Feels Any Pain," and she took just that line and she sings it over and over again and she makes it into a song that she wrote. It's like, so it's this act of transformation that seizes this sort of famously misogynistic Dylan song and makes it into a kind of her anthem. And like, that's the kind of artist she is. What was I I almost called the book that, Nobody Feels Any Pain, but then it felt a little cumbersome. Yeah. The other thing is that Evie and Reuben, there's a love story. And like, that's something that I never would have written 10 years ago. When I started as a 15, when I was first writing books, like I felt totally, I was like, I'm a crime novelist. Like I'm not, it felt like I don't think I know how to describe emotion. So like I kind of stumble into this book that like they meet when they're kids and then they meet again in their 20s and like they like each other, but neither one of them is particularly articulate about it. Like, and arcing that story out was another huge challenge for me that like I got really like, oh, this is a new kind of horizon for me, you know?
Wow. Yeah. Those are spectacular scenes with the command of the audience as well. There's a real sense of, that she's a real showman, that she's really got command of that. It's very cool. Very cool.
Thank you very much.
And let's see. Okay, another question. How has the pandemic impacted your writing, and what does your next project look like?
These are great questions. Make sure before I forget to recommend to all of you, if you haven't read it, to read Kira's book, which is fantastic. It's called Hollow Kingdom, and it's really good. And I deeply appreciate you doing this event with me because I admire your book so much. I mean, I didn't nominate for the Thurber Prize. That's like so amazing.
That's on Friday. That's happening, which is very exciting.
So
yeah, but I also want to say and I'll ask you just before this really quick. Which number? How many books have you written? What number is The Quiet Boy?
Well, Kira, technically this is my 11th novel.
11.
It's bonkers.
Break out the champagne. 11.
You know, the thing is, so two of them, there are a couple of asterisks on those, like, because I wrote Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters. That was my first novel, which is a mashup, so it's a little bit of like, okay, it's a novel, but it's a little bit of a bit. And then I wrote Android Karenina, which is another one in that series. Okay. And then I stopped doing those because I was sort of like, well, I don't want to be the guy who, I don't want to wake up 20 years from now. This is just what I do. I loved writing them so much, and they were joyful, and I actually learned a ton. But then it was like, okay. But anyway, and then I also, two of the books are novels for young readers. So I had actually sold a book for middle grade before Sense and Sensibility came out. So the two sort of happened at the same time. All of which is to say that this is like, I don't even think, yes, I've written 11 books officially. And yeah. Anyway, and to answer your question, Christina, my next book, I'm working on it right now. And that's actually, I'm really glad to be, because it's sort of stressful and anxiety provoking to have this book come out. It's always that way with a new, so I'm like well into my next one. I can even tell you what it's called. It's called Big Time. And it is a corporate espionage, time bending thriller, basically. Yes! It's a espionage novel that's also a book it's not about time travel exactly, but it's about the weirdness of space and time. And it has a woman protagonist, as a matter of fact, who I'm really, really enjoying writing. So all of those things. It's cool. So hopefully we should anticipate seeing that at some point late in, what year is it? Late in 2022, early 2023.
Fabulous. How has the pandemic impacted the writing?
A lot. Basically, with this novel in two very specific ways. One is that this book was actually it was supposed to be set in 2020, right? So the present day timeline was supposed to take place in 2020. And then it was like late March. And I was like, that's not going to work, because like coronavirus was suddenly, obviously, this huge thing. And not only would it be, why aren't all these people talking about the coronavirus? Like, why? And also, like, there's a long section toward the end that's set at an outdoor music festival in the summer of 2020. It was like, no. So basically, we just bumped it back a year. So I had to go through and do a lot of adjusting. And it was a challenge, but it was also like, boo-hoo. I actually wrote a thing about it for Slate, which I'll try to look up and put in that. So in like early April or late March of last year, I sent a thing to Slate. It was like, how the pandemic has fucked up my novel or something. It was just like, oh no. So, but then also, I think just in the very last piece, the last drafts of this book, since I was writing them in early spring, and all of a sudden I was very keenly aware of the role of family in a way that, of course, being a dad has been a big part of my life for the last 15 years, but like all of a sudden everybody was home. And there was this I think we're so lucky in general that I don't have to think about the physical safety of my kids in this day-to-day way, and this sort of sense of peril. And like, I don't want them to get this thing, and I don't want them to be scared and to feel like we're going to get sick. And like that sense of mortality and the sense of protection and love, just like what it means to be a parent is like, in a sense, it's you're afraid, like every day you're a little bit afraid. And like, that's not a big part of being a parent, but it's definitely changes the way you think every day. And like all of that, I think, cast its spell on this book in a way that potentially added to that sense of tenderness. And like a lot of the book is about father and son, and about this fierce love and protection that Beth has for her boy, and like all of that stuff. So it's all in there.
It's fascinating to think of all the impact that this will have on literature and the arts in general. Just the art, like, you were talking about the 2016 artistic response to what was happening politically, and then we're going to start seeing all the responses.
Interesting. A couple people have asked me, and I wonder if they've asked you too, Kira, because your book is quite apocalyptic. Like, people are like, "Oh my God, are you going to write a book about this now?" I'm like, no, thank you. I have no interest. Like, I'm working on this book big time, which again, it's going to take place in real life. But like, I am not writing masks. I have no interest in writing about any, like, no thanks. I just I want to think about anything other than this. And I'm sure there are other authors who feel differently, and I know it'll make itself felt, but like, it feels I'm so ready to just power through it at this point, to move on. Yeah,
I did exactly what you said. I ran away from, I was supposed to travel to research a novel, which obviously then flew out the window. So based on a recommendation from my editor, I started thinking about funny fantasy. And so that was a form of escapism. How can I get as far away as I possibly can? And still not write humans, which is, good. I'm like you with romance, except it's about humans early on in my career. But maybe I'll get there. I'll write about humans.
One day you'll write a human. Humans come through so beautifully, though. I think that, and I was trying to think of like, well, what, because they're like, well, Kira will do this event with you. And I was like, well, what is the connection? Because these books are obviously quite different. But I think that like, they're both about how weird it is to be a human being. Like, because like, it's true, because your humans in your book are represented to us from the point of view of these animals. And like, if you're an animal looking at people, it's like, what is wrong with these animals? They are the weirdest fucking animals with their phones and like they, and they're Seahawks jerseys and everything else that we see in your book. It's like part of what The Quiet Boy is about for me is about like just having a physical body and living in is just weird. It's just weird. So, anyway.
Yeah, I can't remember what it was. I was at a literary event one time, and they described humans as what bald apes in socks wandering around complaining about things. That always stuck with me. Like, we are odd, aren't we? I think I'll write about that. Yeah.
We have the blessing and the curse of self-consciousness and being aware of ourselves as beings, which like that is really it's unique. I mean, I'm not a biologist, but it's pretty unique, I think, of this sense of like waking up and being like, what am I going to do today? Well, does my life have meaning? What about that thing I said to that girl when I was 12? That was weird. Why did I do that? Like dolphins, aren't doing that. Like you're just plowing along,
Yes, I know.
There's one more question that we should probably.
There is. Do you know when the start of do you know when the start of the book, do you know at the start of the book if the ending will convey a more hopeful or more ambiguous sense?
I don't know. I love that question, except that I probably know myself well enough at this point to know that in the main, it's going to convey a somewhat hopeful sense. I think that, and even this book, you could argue about it. Maybe when you get to the end, you can email me and tell me what you think. But like, I think that like,
email me as well. I'm dying to talk about it.
I have a hopeful, and it's funny because like my most, I guess, probably well-known, The Last Policeman trilogy is about the last year of life on Earth. And yet I like to think that it's a little hopeful, because it's like the bottom line of the book is like, there's good people out there, I believe in people, I think we've learned a lot of scary, shitty things about humanity in the last year, but I also think we've learned, at least within my neighborhood, in my home, like there's a lot of goodness in people too. And I think that it's really important to keep it in our hearts, That's so cheesy, but I really think that, we can't just be like, get too much like, oh my God, society's falling apart. Like it's not. Society is okay. And I think that's the thing.
I think that's also partly, I feel, when we write, as people who write apocalyptic fiction, I feel like there's some responsibility to also use it as a lens to talk about, as a, like sort of safely tread those waters through the medium of fiction, to look at this and say, what if, however, there's still hope and we can make change and, and here's the good things about our species, even if we're,
My dog is telling me to wrap it up.
Nope. The dog has spoken.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kira.
Yeah. Well, I think Have we answered? We've answered all the questions.
I think we did it. I think we did it.
Thank
you guys for your nice compliments.
I cannot say enough good things about this book. Congratulations. And I do have a question. Does Book Soup have signed copies?
They do. They do. I signed a bunch of book plate thingies.
Yes.
Right now. I think you guys some book plate things.
Yes, we have book plates.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
If you buy your book from Book Soup, they'll get a signed one. That's awesome.
So I collect them, so I'll be getting one. Yeah.
Oh,
Perfect. Thank you both so much for joining us. Such a wonderful conversation. Congrats, Ben, on your next book. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thank you to my co-host, Millie, because it's hard to do this alone. So
she'll be back for all of your remaining events for the year, Sam. Just to let you know.
I'm really looking forward to it.
Please, if it's free.
Definitely. Thank you.
All right. Everyone have a wonderful night. Sorry, Ben, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No.
Right.
Okay. Night, everyone.